The weight of the rope. The rope had seen better days. Private First Class Jenkins noticed it first as he helped Desmond Doss rig the pulley system against the twisted remains of what had once been a substantial tree. The hemp fibers, salvaged from supply bundles and communication wire spools, showed wear patterns that made Jenkins nervous. Dark stains that could have been mud, frayed sections where the weave had begun to separate under stress. "You sure this thing'll hold, Doc?" Jenkins asked, though he already knew Doss wasn't technically a doctor. None of them were. The 77th Infantry Division had been chewing through trained medics faster than replacement depot could supply them, and here on Hacksaw Ridge, in the rain-soaked hell of Okinawa in late April 1945, medical training mattered less than willingness to keep moving when everyone else had found reasons to stop. Doss tested the rope with a sharp tug, his calloused hands reading the tension like a telegraph operator feeling for signal strength. Below them, the cliff face dropped nearly 400 feet to the staging area where the rest of their company had pulled back to regroup. Above, the plateau stretched in a maze of coral outcroppings, shattered vegetation, and the kind of silence that made every soldier's skin crawl. "It'll hold what it needs to hold," Doss replied, his voice carrying that peculiar mixture of quiet confidence and absolute terror that Jenkins had learned to recognize in men who had been up here too long. "The Lord provides what we need for the work he sets before us." Jenkins wanted to roll his eyes at the religious talk, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Doss's hands shook slightly as he secured the rope around the tree trunk, or the fact that those same hands had already pulled 3 wounded men from exposed positions during the morning's failed advance. The 77th had taken Hacksaw Ridge twice in the past week, only to be forced off by Japanese counterattacks that seemed to emerge from the coral itself. The morning assault had started with confidence. Intelligence reports suggested the Japanese defenders had been weakened by the previous day's naval bombardment, and the approach up the cliff face had met less resistance than expected. But once the leading elements reached the plateau, the ridge had come alive with machine gun nests, mortar positions, and sniper holes that turned every step forward into a calculated gamble with invisible death. The withdrawal order had come through just after noon, a crackling radio message that barely penetrated the steady drumbeat of incoming artillery. Most of the company had made it back down the rope and cargo nets in good order, carrying their wounded and maintaining enough organizational integrity to regroup for another attempt. But not everyone had made it back. Not the men whose voices could still be heard calling "medic" from positions scattered across the plateau, pinned down by crossfire and too badly wounded to crawl to safety. That's when Doss had rigged his rope. "You know the captain's not going to like this," Jenkins said, glancing down at the staging area where Company K was settling into hastily scraped fighting positions. Orders were to pull everyone back, regroup and try again tomorrow with artillery support. Doss followed his gaze downward, where tiny figures moved among the medical tents and supply dumps. The rain that had been threatening all morning was beginning to fall in earnest now, turning the coral dust into slippery mud and making the cliff face even more treacherous than usual. From this angle, the American positions looked absurdly small and vulnerable, a few hundred men clinging to a foothold on an island where every Japanese soldier had been ordered to fight to the death. "Orders were to take care of our wounded," Doss replied, checking the improvised stretcher he'd assembled from rifle stocks and a canvas shelter half. "Last I checked, those men up there are still our wounded." Jenkins had heard this argument before. In the 3 weeks since the 77th had landed on Okinawa, he'd watched Doss navigate the impossible space between military discipline and personal conviction. The man refused to carry a weapon, wouldn't even touch a rifle to move it out of his way, but he'd go places that made armed men think twice. It created a strange tension in the unit, part admiration, part frustration, part something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. The sound of small arms fire echoed from somewhere on the plateau, sharp cracks that meant someone was still alive up there and still in contact with the enemy. Doss's head snapped up at the sound, his body already moving toward the rope before his mind had finished processing the implications. "Doss!" Jenkins grabbed his arm, feeling the coiled tension in the medic's muscles. "You go up there alone, you're not coming back. You know that, right?" For a moment, something flickered across Doss's face. Not doubt exactly, but a kind of weary recognition of what Jenkins was really asking. How many times could a man climb back into a place where survival depended on luck, prayer, and the enemy's momentary inattention? How many trips could the rope handle before physics and probability caught up with good intentions? "Maybe not," Doss said quietly. "But if I don't go, they're definitely not coming back." He stepped to the edge of the cliff, where the rope disappeared into the growing darkness of the plateau above. The rain was falling harder now, turning visibility into a grey curtain that hid everything beyond 50 yards. Somewhere in that maze of coral and shadow, wounded Americans lay waiting for help that might never come. Jenkins watched him climb, hand over hand, until the rain and distance swallowed him completely. Then he settled down to wait by the rope, listening to the distant sounds of gunfire and wondering how long it would be before the line went slack and stayed that way. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The plateau felt different in the rain. What had been hard-packed coral and scattered vegetation during the morning assault now squelched underfoot with the consistency of cemetery mud. Doss moved in short rushes between shell holes and shattered tree stumps, following the sound of voices that seemed to shift and fade with each gust of wind. Private Morrison was the first one he found, wedged behind a coral outcropping with field dressings pressed against wounds that painted dark stains across the improvised bandages. Morrison had taken shrapnel in the leg and shoulder, nothing immediately fatal, but enough to keep him pinned in place when the withdrawal order came through. "Thought you boys had left for good," Morrison whispered as Doss slid into the shallow depression beside him. His face was pale with shock and blood loss, but his eyes tracked clearly and his breathing remained steady. Good signs under the circumstances. "Company's regrouping down below," Doss replied, checking Morrison's pulse and examining the field dressings by touch. In the grey light of the rainy afternoon, colour distinctions became meaningless, but texture and temperature told their own stories. "We're going to get you down there with them." The evacuation took 20 minutes of careful work. Doss had to secure Morrison to the improvised stretcher, drag him 40 yards across open ground to the rope, and then lower him over the cliff edge while Japanese positions remained within easy rifle range. Each step of the process required absolute focus on immediate tasks while deliberately ignoring the larger implications of what he was attempting. The rope held. Morrison reached the bottom safely, signaling his arrival with a prearranged tug that travelled back up the line, one down. But the gunfire Doss had heard earlier suggested more wounded remained scattered across the plateau, and the afternoon was wearing toward evening with uncomfortable speed. Sergeant Howell's voice reached him from somewhere to the northeast, a hoarse call for medical attention that carried undertones of pain and desperate patience. Following the sound led Doss through a section of the ridge that looked like a piece of the moon, nothing but craters, coral chunks, and the twisted metal remains of equipment that had been too damaged or abandoned to retrieve. He found Howell in a shell hole with 2 other men, Corporal Martinez, who was conscious but had taken a bullet through the forearm, and Private Collins, who wasn't conscious at all. Collins had been caught by a mortar burst that left him breathing but unresponsive, the kind of head wound that required immediate evacuation and surgical attention that wouldn't be available for hours. "How many trips you planning to make, Doc?" Howell asked, as Doss worked his way through triage decisions. The sergeant's own wounds were superficial, cuts and bruises from flying coral, nothing that would prevent him from walking if he had somewhere safe to walk to. "As many as it takes," Doss replied, but the practical mathematics of the situation were becoming unavoidable. 3 men, with Collins requiring a stretcher evacuation and Martinez needing assistance. Multiple trips across ground that was almost certainly under observation, using a rope that was already showing signs of wear. And the rain was getting worse, turning the cliff edge into a skating rink where one wrong step would eliminate the evacuation route entirely. The first explosion came without warning, a mortar round that landed somewhere behind them, close enough to shower the shell hole with coral chips, but far enough away to suggest the Japanese weren't sure exactly where their targets were located. Yet, the second explosion fell closer, and the third close enough that Doss could smell the distinctive sharp scent of high explosive mixing with wet coral dust. "They're walking them in," Howell observed, with the kind of professional detachment that kept soldiers functional when geometry and probability were working against them. "Probably heard us moving around up here." Doss nodded, continuing his work on Martinez's arm while his mind raced through logistical calculations. Collins needed to go first, but moving an unconscious man across open ground would take time and create noise. Martinez could probably make it to the rope under his own power, but leaving him alone while evacuating Collins would mean abandoning a wounded man to direct enemy fire. The solution, when it came to him, felt less like tactical brilliance than simple stubbornness dressed up as strategy. All 3 men would move together, with Howell assisting Martinez while Doss handled Collins. A single trip across the plateau, then multiple descents down the rope. It doubled the risk of detection, but eliminated the problem of multiple exposures to enemy fire. "You sure about this, Doc?" Martinez asked as Doss explained the plan. The corporal's voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he checked his rifle and made sure his gear was secured. "If they spot us moving, we're all dead. If we stay here, Collins is dead for certain," Doss replied, securing the unconscious private to the stretcher with bootlaces and strips of canvas. "Sometimes the choice isn't between safe and dangerous. Sometimes it's between 2 kinds of dangerous, and you pick the one that gets your people home." They moved just as the light began to fail, 4 shapes crawling and dragging their way across a landscape that looked increasingly alien in the gathering darkness. Behind them, Japanese voices called out coordinates and range adjustments. Ahead, the rope waited at the cliff edge, a thin line connecting the plateau's isolation to the relative safety of American positions below. The rope was still holding, but as Doss lowered Collins into the darkening void below Hacksaw Ridge, he could feel individual fibers beginning to separate under his hands, each strand carrying more weight than hemp and prayer were designed to bear. Captain Welsh found Jenkins waiting by the rope as the last of the afternoon light faded into the grey murk of an Okinawan evening. The company commander looked like a man who had spent the day receiving reports he didn't want to hear. Casualty counts, ammunition status, and intelligence assessments that painted tomorrow's prospects in increasingly dark colors. "How many has he brought down?" Welsh asked, studying the frayed rope that disappeared upward into the rain and mist. "4 so far," Jenkins replied. "Morrison, Collins, Martinez, and Sergeant Howell. Collins was in bad shape. Head wound. They took him straight back to the aid station." Welsh nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. As company commander, he operated in the uncomfortable space between the tactical realities his men faced and the strategic demands that filtered down from battalion and regiment. The 77th Infantry Division was under pressure to maintain momentum in the Okinawa campaign, to keep advancing and taking ground even when the ground itself seemed designed to kill everyone who stepped on it. "Any word from regiment about tomorrow's assault?" Jenkins asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "We go again at dawn," Welsh replied. "Naval gunfire support starting at 0530, artillery prep at 0600, infantry assault at 0630, Same plan, more guns. The simplicity of it was almost beautiful, Jenkins thought. More firepower applied to the same problem, as if Hacksaw Ridge were a mathematical equation that could be solved by adding sufficient variables to one side. He'd been in the Pacific long enough to know that Japanese defensive positions rarely yielded to purely quantitative solutions, but he'd also been in the army long enough to know that strategic alternatives were above his pay grade. Another tug on the rope signaled another evacuation in progress. Jenkins helped guide the stretcher as it emerged from the darkness above. Private Patterson, semi-conscious but alive, with wounds that looked survivable given proper medical attention. As they transferred Patterson to the waiting medics, Jenkins caught a glimpse of Doss's face in the brief flare of a cigarette lighter. The medic looked exhausted beyond simple fatigue, as if each trip up the rope was costing him something that couldn't be replenished by rest or food. "How many more are up there?" Captain Welsh called up to Doss, his voice barely carrying over the sound of rain and distant artillery. "Hard to say for sure," Doss called back. "At least 3 I know about. Maybe more scattered around that I haven't found yet." Welsh and Jenkins exchanged glances. The tactical situation was clear enough. A single unarmed medic operating alone on enemy-held ground, trying to locate and evacuate wounded men who might or might not still be alive. It violated every principle of sound military planning, ignored basic force protection protocols, and represented exactly the kind of individual initiative that could either win medals or court-martial proceedings. "Doss!" Welsh called. "You've done enough. Come down, and we'll get those men tomorrow when we retake the ridge." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Jenkins began to wonder if Doss had heard the order, or if he was considering how to respond to a direct command from his company commander. When the medic's voice finally drifted down through the rain, it carried a quality that Jenkins had never heard before. Not defiance exactly, but something that might have been gentle, immovable certainty. "Sir, with respect, tomorrow might be too late for them. They're hurt now. They need help now. And if you get yourself killed up there, who's going to help the men we'll lose tomorrow?" Another long pause, filled with the sound of rain drumming against helmets and the distant crump of artillery rounds falling somewhere else on the ridgeline. When Doss spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost conversational. "Captain, I can't carry a rifle. Can't shoot back when they're shooting at me. Can't provide covering fire for my squad. Can't do half the things a soldier's supposed to do in combat. But I can do this. I can go places and bring people back. And right now, that's what they need." Welsh removed his helmet and ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that spoke to frustrations that went far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Command decisions in combat rarely came with clear moral frameworks, and the gap between what regulations suggested and what circumstances demanded could be wide enough to swallow good men whole. "How's the rope holding up?" he asked finally. Jenkins examined the portion he could see, feeling for loose fibers and testing the tension. "It's fraying pretty badly where it rubs against the cliff edge. Hard to say how much more weight it'll take." "Then we reinforce it," Welsh decided. "Strip some rope from the cargo nets, double up the anchor points. If Doss is going to keep making trips, at least we can make sure he's got something reliable to come back down on." As they worked to strengthen the rope system, Jenkins found himself thinking about the mathematics of heroism, how many individual acts of courage added up to a legend, and whether the men who performed those acts ever fully understood the weight of what they were carrying. Doss had already evacuated more wounded from Hacksaw Ridge than most medics would handle in an entire campaign, but he kept climbing back up as if the work were somehow incomplete. Above them, the sound of small arms fire echoed across the plateau. Someone was still alive up there, still fighting, still calling for help in the darkness. And somewhere in that maze of coral and shadow, a man who refused to carry a weapon was crawling toward the sound of voices that might already have fallen silent. "Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The rope stretched thin as spider silk in the darkness, each fiber carrying weight that felt measured in souls rather than pounds. Doss lowered Private Turner over the cliff edge, with hands that had long since stopped feeling the individual burns and cuts that mapped his palms like a geographic survey of the night's work. Turner had been the hardest to find, trapped in a collapsed fighting position near the northern edge of the plateau, semi-conscious and calling for his mother in a voice that barely carried 20 feet through the rain. By the time Doss reached him, enemy movement could be heard from multiple directions, the soft shuffle of boots on wet coral that meant Japanese patrol units were beginning to probe forward under cover of darkness. The descent took forever. Turner's weight seemed to increase with each foot of rope that passed through Doss's burning hands, and twice the improvised stretcher caught on coral outcroppings that required careful maneuvering to clear. Below, barely visible in the murky glow of shielded flashlights, Jenkins and 2 other soldiers guided the stretcher to solid ground and began the process of transferring Turner to the waiting medics. 7 men. Doss had pulled 7 wounded soldiers from Hacksaw Ridge since the afternoon withdrawal, each one requiring a separate climb back up the cliff face and a separate journey across ground that seemed increasingly alive with enemy movement. His body felt hollow with exhaustion, running on reserves of energy that probably didn't exist anymore. But the mathematics of the situation remained brutally simple. Voices still called from the darkness above, which meant work still remained to be done. "That's 8, Jenkins called up as the rope came back up empty, the count including Sergeant Howell, who had been able to climb down on his own. "How many more, you figure, are up there?" The question hung in the rain-soaked air like an accusation. Doss had stopped trying to maintain an accurate count of the wounded remaining on the plateau, partly because the numbers kept shifting as he discovered men he hadn't known were there, and partly because precise accounting felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. Each voice that called medic represented a separate moral equation, a choice between safety and responsibility that couldn't be solved through tactical planning. "I don't know," he called back, and the honesty in his voice carried a weight that made Jenkins look away. "As long as I keep hearing them call, I keep going back." The 9th evacuation nearly killed him. Private Edwards had been caught in the open during the morning assault and had spent the day slowly bleeding from wounds that weren't immediately fatal but wouldn't stop on their own. By the time Doss found him, Edwards was barely conscious and had lost enough blood that moving him required constant attention to breathing and pulse. The trip back to the rope took an hour of careful movement across ground that seemed to shift and settle with each step. Enemy flares periodically lit up sections of the plateau, forcing Doss to freeze in whatever cover he could find, while harsh white light revealed the battlefield in snapshots of devastation. During one particularly long illumination, he counted at least a dozen Japanese soldiers moving through positions less than 100 yards away. Getting Edwards down the cliff required modifications to the stretcher system that Doss improvised by feel in near-total darkness. The wounded soldier's blood pressure was dropping, his breathing becoming shallow and irregular, and every minute spent on the plateau increased the likelihood that both of them would end up staying there permanently. But the rope held. Edwards reached the bottom alive, barely, and was rushed immediately to the aid station, where Dr. Richardson and his medical team performed the kind of emergency care that would either save lives or provide dignified endings. One more man who might see home again, because someone had been willing to climb back into a place where survival depended on luck and prayer in roughly equal measure. The 10th evacuation broke something inside the rope and inside Doss himself. He found Private Nakamura, a Japanese-American soldier from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team who had been attached to the 77th as an interpreter, lying in a shell hole with both legs shattered by mortar fragments. Nakamura was conscious, lucid, and quietly certain he was going to die on Hacksaw Ridge. "Just leave me, Doc," Nakamura whispered, as Doss worked to stabilize his wounds with the few remaining medical supplies in his aid bag. "Use your energy for someone who's got a better chance." The suggestion hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything Doss believed about the value of individual human life. Military triage doctrine supported Nakamura's assessment. In situations where medical resources were limited, treating less severely wounded patients could save more lives overall, but doctrine felt abstract and distant compared to the man lying in front of him, breathing and talking and trying to give away his own chance at survival. "Nobody gets left behind," Doss replied, fashioning splints from broken rifle stocks and securing them with strips torn from his own uniform. "That's the deal we made when we put on these uniforms. We all go home, or none of us do." The evacuation required 2 trips. First, Nakamura, unconscious from shock and blood loss, lowered down the increasingly unreliable rope while Doss whispered prayers that had become as automatic as breathing. Then Doss himself, climbing down hand over hand, while fatigue and stress made his muscles tremble with each movement. At the bottom, Captain Welch was waiting with hot coffee and a direct order to stop. "That's enough, son," Welch said quietly. "You've done more than anyone could ask, more than anyone should ask." Doss accepted the coffee with hands that shook badly enough to slosh the liquid against the sides of the metal cup. Around him, the aid station bustled with quiet efficiency as medical personnel worked to stabilize and treat the men he'd brought down from the ridge. 10 wounded soldiers who would have died alone in the darkness, now receiving care that might give them a chance to survive the war. But somewhere above them, the plateau remained littered with voices that might still be calling for help in the rain. The secret Desmond Doss never shared, the truth that wouldn't find its way into any medal citation or newspaper account, happened during the 11th evacuation. By then, the rope had frayed to the point where individual strands were snapping under tension. The improvised stretcher had been rebuilt twice with materials that grew increasingly creative, and Doss himself was operating in a space beyond normal human endurance. He found Private Williams in a crater near the center of the plateau, wounded but stable, calling for help in a voice that carried clearly through the rain. What Doss didn't find until he slid into the crater was the Japanese soldier lying 5 feet away. Young, maybe 18, gut-shot and dying slowly, watching Doss with eyes that held pain and terror in roughly equal measure. For 30 seconds that felt like hours, the 3 of them occupied the same space without moving or speaking. Williams, semi-conscious but aware enough to recognize the tactical situation. The Japanese soldier, too badly wounded to be a threat, but still very much alive. And Doss, crouched between them with medical supplies that wouldn't stretch to treat 2 men and a set of convictions that had never accounted for this particular moral geometry. Military doctrine was clear. Enemy wounded were to be disarmed, searched for intelligence, and evacuated for medical treatment if tactically feasible. But tactical feasibility was a luxury that didn't exist on Hacksaw Ridge after dark, with a rope that might not survive another full-weight evacuation and Japanese patrols moving through positions that were far too close for comfort. The choice, when it crystallized in Doss's mind, felt less like a decision than like recognition of something that had already been decided by forces beyond his control. He moved to the Japanese soldier first, checking wounds and pulse with the same professional care he'd shown every other casualty of the night. The young man's injuries were beyond field treatment, but Doss could ease his pain and ensure he didn't die alone in the darkness. Williams watched in silence as Doss used precious morphine and bandages on an enemy soldier, his face cycling through expressions that ranged from disbelief to something that might have been understanding. When Doss finally turned his attention to the American's wounds, Williams grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Why?" Williams asked quietly. The question carried weight beyond its simple vocabulary. Why risk medical supplies? Why spend time that might cost both of them their lives? Why treat an enemy soldier with the same care shown to American wounded? The answers, when Doss tried to articulate them, felt inadequate to the moment. "Because he's hurt," Doss replied. "Because he's scared. Because somebody's mother is never going to see him come home." They evacuated Williams first, leaving Doss alone with the Japanese soldier in the crater, while rain continued to fall and enemy voices called out coordinates and movement instructions from positions that seemed to be drawing closer. The young man was unconscious now, his breathing shallow but steady, his pulse weak but present. What happened next was something Doss would carry for the rest of his life, a memory that would surface during quiet moments and peaceful evenings when the weight of survival began to feel heavier than the weight of combat. He rigged the Japanese soldier into the stretcher system, secured him with the same care he'd shown every American casualty, and lowered him down the cliff face to where American medics waited in the darkness below. Dr. Richardson was waiting at the bottom, along with Captain Welsh and a small crowd of soldiers who had gathered to watch the seemingly impossible evacuation work continue. When the stretcher reached the ground and they saw the uniform and equipment of an enemy soldier, the silence that followed felt charged with questions that nobody knew how to ask. "He was wounded," Doss said simply, answering the accusations that hadn't been spoken. "Same as the rest of them." What he didn't say, what the citation would never record, was that treating the Japanese soldier had required him to confront the logical conclusion of his own beliefs about the value of human life. It was one thing to refuse to carry a weapon based on religious conviction. It was another thing entirely to extend medical care to someone who had been trying to kill American soldiers hours earlier. The rope failed completely during the 12th evacuation attempt. Doss had climbed back up to search for any remaining wounded, moving by feel and sound through a landscape that seemed increasingly surreal in the darkness. He found 2 more wounded Americans, Corporal Blake and Private Martinez, both ambulatory, but needing assistance to reach the cliff edge. The rope snapped as Doss was testing it for the final evacuation run. One moment he was checking the tension and examining the anchor points. The next, he was holding 15 feet of frayed hemp while the rest of the line disappeared into the void below. Blake and Martinez looked at the broken rope, then at each other, then at Doss, with expressions that suggested they were beginning to understand the tactical situation. "Well," Blake observed with the kind of gallows humor that kept soldiers functional in impossible situations, "this complicates things." What followed was an hour of improvised problem-solving that would have been impressive under normal circumstances, and felt miraculous given the context. Using bootlaces, web gear, and strips of canvas torn from abandoned equipment, Doss and the 2 wounded soldiers created a new descent system that was equal parts engineering and prayer. Blake went down first, rappelling on a line that consisted mostly of knotted fabric and stubbornness. Then Martinez, moving slowly but successfully through darkness that hid both the ground below and the improvised nature of their solution. Doss came down last, alone on Hacksaw Ridge for the first time since the evacuation work had begun. The plateau felt different without wounded voices calling through the rain, quieter, emptier, somehow larger in the darkness. He'd found and evacuated 13 men from ground that military doctrine suggested should have been written off until morning, using equipment that shouldn't have worked and taking risks that probably shouldn't have succeeded. As he rappelled down the improvised line toward American positions, Doss realized that everything about the night would eventually be compressed into a few clean sentences in an official report. 13 wounded, evacuated. Enemy position neutralized through individual initiative, recommend for appropriate recognition. What wouldn't make it into any report was the weight he would carry, the Japanese soldier's face in the moments before unconsciousness, the sound of Blake's laughter when the rope snapped, the way his hands would shake for months afterward whenever he heard rain drumming against a roof. The legend would be light and clean. The memory would be heavy and complicated and entirely his to carry. 3 weeks later, in a field hospital on Saipan, Doss woke from dreams filled with fraying rope and distant voices to find Colonel Hamilton sitting beside his cot with a clipboard full of official papers and questions that felt like they belonged to a different war entirely. "The recommendation has gone through channels," Hamilton said without preamble, his voice carrying the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that turned human experiences into administrative processes. "Medal of Honor. Full citation. They want details for the official record." Doss shifted position on the narrow cot, feeling the weight of exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to remedy. Through the tent walls, he could hear the sounds of the field hospital. Doctors making rounds, wounded men talking quietly, the occasional groan of someone waking up to pain that medication couldn't completely eliminate. Normal sounds that felt strangely distant after the silence of Hacksaw Ridge. "What kind of details?" he asked, though he already suspected where the conversation was heading. Hamilton consulted his clipboard with the expression of a man who had conducted similar interviews many times before. "Official count of evacuees, timeline of events, tactical situation assessment, the usual documentation requirements." The questions that followed were straightforward and impossible to answer accurately. How many wounded soldiers had been evacuated? 13, but that number included a Japanese soldier whose presence would complicate the narrative. What was the duration of the action? 7 hours, but that didn't account for the psychological time that existed in combat, where minutes felt like hours and hours collapsed into moments. What equipment was employed? Salvaged rope, improvised stretchers, and prayer, though the last item probably wouldn't make it into the official record. "There's one other thing," Hamilton said as he finished his notes. "They want you to meet with a war correspondent. Life magazine, something about personal interest stories from the Pacific Theater." The suggestion made Doss's stomach clench with anxiety that felt different from combat stress. The idea of explaining Hacksaw Ridge to a civilian, of translating the weight of rope burns and distant voices into something that would make sense to readers back home, seemed both impossible and vaguely obscene. "I'd rather not," he said quietly. Hamilton looked up from his clipboard with an expression that suggested this wasn't the first time a potential Medal of Honor recipient had been reluctant to cooperate with public relations requirements. "It's not exactly optional, son. The folks back home need to hear about what our boys are doing out here. Good for morale, good for war bond sales." What they talked about instead, during the hour that followed, was everything the citation wouldn't say. The sound Blake made when the rope snapped, half laughter, half sob. The weight of the Japanese soldier in his arms as he rigged the stretcher system. The way his hands had shaken so badly during the final descent that he'd nearly lost his grip twice. The mathematics of conscience that led to choices that couldn't be explained through military doctrine. Hamilton listened with the expression of a man who had heard similar stories before and would hear them again, taking notes that would probably never make it into any official document. When Doss finished talking, the colonel closed his clipboard and sat quietly for several minutes, watching rain fall against the tent walls. "For what it's worth," Hamilton said finally, "the men you brought down that night, most of them are going to make it home. Blake's already stateside. Martinez is in a hospital in Hawaii, but they think he'll keep the leg. Even the interpreter, Nakamura, he's going to walk again. The information should have felt like victory, like justification for the risks taken and the prices paid. Instead, it felt like a weight that Doss would carry alongside all the other weights from Hacksaw Ridge, the responsibility that came with other men's survival, the knowledge that luck and prayer had been the margin between life and death. 2 months later, President Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Doss's neck in a White House ceremony that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. The citation read cleanly, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as a company aid man, followed by a paragraph that compressed 7 hours of terror and stubbornness into language appropriate for official documentation. What it didn't mention was the Japanese soldier whose treatment had been quietly omitted from the final report. What it couldn't capture was the sound of 13 different voices calling medic through the rain, or the way the rope had felt in his hands during each descent, burning and solid and treacherous all at once. 30 years later, in a small house in Georgia, Doss would keep a length of hemp rope in his desk drawer, not the original line from Hacksaw Ridge, which had been cut up and distributed among the survivors, but a similar piece that carried the same weight of memory. Sometimes, on rainy nights when sleep wouldn't come easily, he would hold the rope in his hands and remember the mathematics of conscience that had led him back up the cliff face 13 times. The legend that grew around Hacksaw Ridge was clean and inspiring, the kind of story that affirmed faith in human goodness and divine providence. But legends were light things, built from selected facts and careful omissions. The real weight, the memory of individual faces and the sound of fraying fibers under stress, belonged to the men who had lived through it, carried quietly in the space between what happened and what could be safely shared with a world that needed heroes more than it needed complications. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.